In progress.
Oh,
Sunday the screenshot.
my phone battery.
Mine's on crap.
It'll just take me a minute to get the going. Okay. Thank you, Leslie. All right, call this meeting of the HDC Organizational Focus Committee to order. It's Wednesday, November 16th, a little bit after 3:30. Let's see. Roll call, let's see, myself, and Bill Oliver, we can go off the agenda.
I
Carried unanimously. Minutes. As May is out of the room, but just this is my minutes. New business, actually, this, my apologies, it should be other business, but the business is still the business. Discuss and take action on matters pertaining to HDC best practices, initiative. And then we'll pick up the HDC RISE work group related discussion, and in particular, our homework on this, the existing guidelines. So on the best practices, I mean, I'll just summarize where, is that cool with you?
yeah,
So, for the records here, at last night's HDC meeting, I brought up a list of items, a list of protocols to either establish or revisit or reestablish. And those are applications with grade changes, grade related application materials, and related topics. To do review of applications using tablets and projector meetings. Revisit protocol for incomplete applications, revisit protocol for timely submission of supplemental application materials. Revisit previous protocol addressing waiting period after denial. Establish protocol to eliminate extended non-material responsiveness by an applicant or agent. And establish protocol for application postponements by applicants' agents. Some of these are, we've been doing the OOC for a while.
years.
Did a couple of years in 16 or 17 and 18, and then a little bit of sabbatical, and I think it's been the better part of this year. These matters, just to clarify, are other items that we discussed during probably one of those meetings, or I say probably because not all of them were necessarily discussed at an OMC meeting. And during HDC meetings, as topics of conversation over the last 6 years. My emphasis has always been on best practices, and though, certainly not infallible. We've been discussing many, if not all of these, for a number of years. Any we haven't been discussing, I'll give the HCC the credit, and I'll take the blame if they don't do well, if they fail. But I listed out some thoughts that I had too. It's hard to recall exactly which ones we talked about over the years and which ones that have been in my head, and I've maybe thought of conversations that would be happening in the years. But in any event, that is a list of best practice initiatives. There are a handful of others at minimum, and we will be pursuing those in discussion with deliberations tomorrow with the HDC board membership. Does that sound fair and reasonable and accurate to you?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We're going to move right over to the resiliently integrating sustainable energy work group. To bring us into focus, we last week got up to the item addressing the layout and other matters that are covered in the HDC solar technologies guidelines. And we determined that for homework, everyone would review the solar technology guidelines, and we would try and again flesh out related items we would like to talk about in the future. And this will also be an opportunity for Val and I to focus on making some notes where the HDC has diverged from the written guideline and adopted verbally guidelines, such as solar would be on the entirety of the roof plane, so as not to create, as we often refer to as sawtooth effect, or some other type of potential visual noise that would catch your eye. With that, Bill, do you want to just walk us through these? And I don't mean to spring it on you, but I don't need to talk all the time.
No, you're doing good.
Okay.
Thank you.
So the HDC guidelines on solar break down into two categories. One is the photovoltaic systems that we commonly think of when someone says solar, and the other is solar thermal systems, and which are not widely used on the subject. But I think it's appropriate, unless you guys think otherwise, that consistent with our other discussions, we talk about them as basically one and the same for the purpose of aesthetics. Is that fair?
I think we can define any differences in the glossary.
Okay,
So
yeah,
otherwise, yeah, yes, I think that's appropriate.
I mean, yeah, for today.
Sure, okay.
Okay, but that's a good point.
That one of you guys might be able to answer. The house, the little house across from Millie's that has solar panels on it. The house, the big house in back of it was moved, it was called End House, and it got moved over. And that's the little cottage, and I forget the name of the cottage, but you see it right there. And it seems like those are not the typical ones I think of. I know we approved it as an experiment. They kind of stick up.
They're solar thermal.
That's what I'm
Yeah,
asking.
they are.
Okay, that's the difference.
So it's typically a deeper installation because you've got the solar materials running got the system to distribute the heated water and to circulate not cooled, but cooler water through the system as it exchanges it. The heat, which captures the energy and translates it to electrical, or translates it to, it could be a hot water system in the house, maybe a potable system where it's helping with the hot water, heat the hot water for the house. But yeah, it's typically thicker because of the fact that there's more involved in the depth than a simple flat electrical.
So
It's a,
with that said, I think they should be two categories.
Okay, so we'll discuss them. That's cool with me. That's what I'm asking.
yeah,
Okay.
like there's some accommodations for a solar PV roof system on black asphalt. Is typically a requirement for the most part, but it's evacuated tube, so it's a tube, and it's about as long as this table, and there's 16 of them in a row, right? So by the time you get the system installed on brackets, it's the top of that tube is about that far off the roof deck.
And they're like silvery.
Yeah, they're
Yeah.
silver and they have bluish tint.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
maybe like that, right?
So, yeah, I would just.
So these systems don't actually have hydro circulation.
They do. There's a node at the end, and so the brackets themselves have the tube come up from the basement, run through that bottom node. That's where the heat is transferred to the tube, and then cycles back down into the basement. So it's a loop in that sense. It's running through the panel, picking up heat, and it's extracting from the tubes and dropping back into the basement and coming back up and going around.
Okay,
That's
Yeah.
a good technical.
well, but I think they're so different, I think we should keep them separate.
Primarily due to the color and.
Yeah.
Yeah, and at minimum include a photo, what they are here,
Yeah.
you know.
That's a good idea. And the other thing on that is, maybe I'm confusing this with another one in Manica, but is that a silver? I thought that was a dark color panel,
I think they're trimmed in silver.
Yeah, we might have silver.
but the panel themselves I thought were dark. I was out there
Yeah,
like
I think you're right, Steve.
2 weeks ago.
And it's, the PV stuff can often come that way as well. It can come with a black panel and silver rim.
Yeah,
And, I don't say we've never done that, maybe on a ground array, if buried in the wood somewhere, we might have done that, but if it's on a roof, we use a black rim and a black panel.
Right.
Okay.
And just as we're talking about pictures, let's start using, approved Nantucket photos. I don't think that this ground array.
Oh, this is old.
Right,
Yeah.
yeah, so as we update and upgrade this,
Yeah.
let's use relevant examples from town. Or from the island if we can.
I captured one on Duke's Road that we could install. Okay, no, those are good points, so. Picture of each side, Nantucket pictures, general comments, glossary. Placement of design and photovoltaic and solar, placement and design of photovoltaic and solar thermal systems. So recommended solar panels incorporated into the trellis. Yes, still valid. Figure 8. I'm just doing the pictures, but
Yeah.
I'm simple-minded. Panels placed on upper 2/3 of roof and aligned with windows. So I wonder if we can revisit this. So let me just say the other thing. Conversely, not recommended panels on the lower 2/3 of the roof. So panels on the upper third or the upper 2/3 of the roof aligned with windows in the old guidelines. And not on the lower 2/3, period. And the HDC's current and probably 4-year in running, maybe 5 years in running, is that it would be the better entirety of the roof, so it's not to fall attention. I would like to take today and like bite into this a little bit. I'm gonna diverge from our, we're trying to flesh out the outline for future discussion. And actually just talk about these because they're pretty well developed. We can add topics that we want to for group discussion. But if you all want to just kind of, we can do some pre-discussion on this. And the thing I would like to consider is, do we want to pursue whether this idea of the whole roof versus the upper 2/3?
I think that's gone. I think that mindset, both of those are gone.
Because I'm looking at figure 11, and the reason I asked is if we should, what I'm asking is, let's talk, what I'm saying is, let's talk about these, and then I'm asking about this particular one, because it's the first one. Solar panels incorporated in the trellis, done, pergola is done. So we'll jump to figure 11, panels placed on the upper 2/3 of the roof. The way this is drawn, I think, is actually much less objectionable than I would have thought after sitting in for 6 years and looking at these applications. But
Who has 2 panels?
that's, I think the problem is it's only, yeah,
Right.
it's so extensive, the request for installations is never.
You mean you're never gonna see that in an application?
Right.
Right.
Request 2 panels, okay.
So I prefer to get rid of that and do one with all, like you said,
Well-
picture.
But that is a relevant installation for solar thermal. That accommodates a substantial amount of BTUs for a hot water system. So if it's already approvable and someone were to come to us and come to the HDC and
But
say,
that's not, if it's the front.
But so then maybe that's one of the things that we're gonna, so here, we're gonna hybrid a little bit. One of the things we're gonna discuss when we have a full group is this layout, figure 11 for solar thermal installations. And where we weigh in on that is whether we think the HDC would be receptive to it, and so in what circumstances. So we may say, just an example, as a result of that discussion, yes, we recommend the upper 2/3 for solar thermal under these circumstances. A, B, C, and D. For instance, not visible, obviously. A, B, not on the front of the house. Totally. C, something like that.
Okay.
So solar thermal location, this concept of 2/3
That was good to know.
to be revisited.
yeah, it's important. A good example of how much solar thermal you need for a building is 25 Dukes Road, approved by HDC. They've got a full solar PV array. You guys did that, right, Tim?
Yep.
But they also on the shed have 4 solar thermal panels. And they may not be evacuated tubes because there's a couple different styles, so we really need to dig in and define those. But on that shed, which is small, 10 by 18 maybe, they've got 4 of them across, and that heats the entire house. So it's only 4 panels. So this is a good example of how it could be very relevant for that type of roof structure.
Okay, so I made a note for the glossary items is not only PV thermal, but thermal subtypes with characteristics.
Right.
And that characteristics could cover a variety of topics. And then for this solar thermal, this concept of 2/3 we revisited with group and HDC current, a guideline, current PV. Only read my handwriting, I'm so successful. HDC current PV is fullish roof in part due to number of panels within typical application.
Well, I don't think the lower 2/3 is out either then.
Yeah, if it's not visible.
Is that, right,
So I'll just draw an arrow to
yeah,
applicability. Yeah, I mean, because look, if I certainly think we want to be making this easier, and if there's for some reason for an install or company a benefit to utilizing, I would think that it's the higher part of the roof. But just with respect to bordering vegetation, but there might be a reason that they want to have it in the lower part of the roof, and if it's not visible, why do we care?
right.
I mean, not visible because it's like on the back of the house, not visible because there's a deciduous tree there for 6 months. Tim?
Yeah, we see three in broad strokes, 3 categories.
Okay.
Right, when it's absolutely not visible, then the rules would ideally be minimum in terms of placement, layout, and so forth. Right? When they're visible, then you have absolute clarity around the shape and what isn't, or what is it a best practice? Is it a rule? Is it a guideline? Right? I think that would be useful to get it approved. And then there's sort of the front of the house, that third category. What are the circumstances? Because that are potentially approvable when it's on the front of the house. And presumably it's got to meet all the guidelines that's in level 2, plus a bunch of additional criteria.
Right, and that's what we've been referring to as our mitigations.
Right.
Right.
Type 2 tree or something like that. So, yeah, no, I think that's helpful to understand what someone who is an installer would be looking for. It makes sense and it jives with I think the approach we're going to take on our recommendations, but it's worthwhile to be pointed out with some clarity. So thank you. Located on the primary facade and highly visible is, one of the big no's. Without, in some circumstances, mitigation, and another is just a no.
And this is just, I think from the economics and the installation perspective, the best practice there, I believe aligns with what we're talking about in category 2, rectangles. That's what we talk about amongst ourselves in class. Rectangles. Make it clean, make it make it blend in. Fill the plane, make it blend in.
So the picture with the dormers is not something,
Yeah, so that would,
unless that was in category number 1.
right, and not this.
And even then, we avoid, for what it's worth again, if we see a pitch with dormers, we kind of go like this.
Because you're gonna get shadow.
Shadows, it's expensive to install, you know, it's not practical.
Okay.
So it's not, I'm not saying we wouldn't do it, but it'd probably be on the back of the house,
Right,
right? It's just, and the owner's gotta tell us, they really, we would never install around dormer. We hate installing. around
Yeah.
dormer.
it just looks wonky.
Yeah, I agree, we think it was one.
Yeah.
Okay, you know, I want to point out before we go further, one of the things that's not in this little excerpt is the other shared responsibility, which is, relates to carbon sequestration. And, you know, we very often see a home taken down, taken to the dump, which is a cost, not an HDC cost, but, you know, a cost to the community. And a brand new house with, you know, 10-foot ceilings on 2 floors and higher load requirements, and then a request to save the world by not tripping, you know, literally that's the request that we get at the table as well. We want to save the world by putting in solar, but we just carted away a house with all this carbon in it. So I just mention it because it is an important aspect of the existing guidelines. It comes down, you know, it talks about windows, it talks about weather enhancements, you know, things like through mass save typically do. And that is something that I think we're going to need to look at some point as part of our process, is updating those two. I think that those are valid community goals. They're consistent with, you know, the concept of saving the world, but they seem to have been set aside, and I think a little too conveniently. I'm not suggesting by installers. It's just, it's not the mindset anymore. It's, you know, there isn't a budgeting necessity on the part of many of our, you know, people who are building new homes. Not all of them, but many of them don't have that in their mind.
It's funny you mention it.
Hmm.
There's a confirmed standard being developed with ResNet for herd raters to study embodied carbon of materials in buildings. And I'm actually writing the benchmark study through Northeast Hers Alliance right now for the state of Mass that'll be used for the national application. So we have tools as herd raters. We have the tools that we can do these analytics to know what the existing house value is and what a new house value is.
But what good is that?
She spoke up,
Okay, go ahead. Go on, sir.
and I just want to reemphasize, we're very loose today. So don't get this in your back. We still got a lot to do with going through that list in an organized way.
Mhm.
Go ahead.
No, I wasn't,
You said, what does that?
yeah, what are you guys talking about?
I think I can help a little.
Okay.
So I think where you're going with that, Stephen, is that, you know, there are people on Nantucket that have a bottomless pit of a budget. And they're building giant homes. And they feel like they are, and what we call them the multimillionaires with a heart. And they want to try and do the right thing for the environment. And so they come to us and they say, help me power my home, my 10,000 square foot home.
I'm
And
flying on my jet to see. if
yeah,
they
exactly,
can.
right. And where we can, we'll design a ground array, typically if it's something that big, to power the entire home. Now, I think the answer to what you're looking for is what Andy brings to the table, which is the net zero rating. Right? If they're building these homes that are so big with disregard to their carbon footprint, then mandating that they have a certain PERS rating is going to force them to make the house smaller, because there is only so much solar we can put on these properties. And so the other thing they've got to do is make the house smaller. Don't have 3 floors of 10-foot ceilings. Right? Because to get to the net, whatever it is, net 5, net 10, net 0. But if they're required to get to that, they've either got to make the house smaller or they've got to put a bigger solar system. And at some point, you guys just, we can't put a, National Grid won't let us put a solar system on a property above a certain size, because we're limited by the size of the transformer.
Right, so I appreciate that, Tim. There's a little jujitsu in there though,
Oh, I
because,
know, and you don't have the authority, I think.
well, we don't, and we also then, if we're promoting net zero in a way, we're promoting people to come to us with the maximum allowable solar array, which is to the extent as we get this in a visible location or an area that, you know, again, visible being something that I'm gonna say anything that even a tree is hiding. You know, something in the front, something viewed from the primary entryway, from the public way. We would be promoting, I'm not suggesting we don't, I don't know where we get involved in it. I actually have this on our list in a slightly different form, and it talks about the surcharge of these homes being built that are larger than typical, you know, 7.5, 8 foot ceilings, you know, maybe 2,500 square feet, which is, you know, a typical home for a family of 3. But the carbon sequestration fits in, the net zero fits in. The carbon sequestration is where we've lost sight. That's part of the point too, is I want to make is what are, you know, it's fraudulent. You know, it's intellectually dishonest for people to think they're helping the environment when they come in and they rip down a structure that was built in 1990, which we're seeing very frequently now. I wouldn't say very, but we're seeing more and more frequently. And it's going to the landfill. So yeah, it'll be interesting to get into that discussion. I'm going to bring us back to this one though. And let's see. We've gotten through this page. I mean, there's some good text in here. I'm not just going by the pictures, but for instance, whenever possible, the least visible installation of ground arrays is preferred. If it is necessary for an array to be placed on a structure, it is encouraged that the array be placed somewhat other than on the primary structure. For example, it goes on to talk about ancillary structures, detached garages, sheds, things along those lines. So then it shows recommended on the next page, which is figure 12, which is, you know, what we often talk about is this concept of panels on a secondary mass. And then I guess the question is, in the interest of fairness, is some discussion, maybe not today, but before on are there instances, what instances do installations on a secondary mass fall into a type 2 or a 3, a type 3, which is mitigation, and they can be approved if they were otherwise visible from the primary street. I'm not suggesting that we're gonna.
I think we've done that.
Yeah, but for the purposes of providing clear guidance. And also for institutional knowledge as this goes forward, so that, you know, as the HDC changes over the next 5 or 10 years, there is, you know, there's some documentation and it's clear, it's like bullet points, if A, B, C, or a combination of these. I mean, typically the way to do this and it is to try and establish an index and then value these. So you value the different levels of mitigation, the different types of mitigation. Maybe they're minuses, and then the pluses are it's not visible. It's visible on a secondary mass. I'm not suggesting it would be simple, but there might be a way to come up with this would have been wonderful when we get to this point to have a resource like an engineering student to sit down and figure this out. But if you could do a numerical reference, so someone could just turn an application. Boom, 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 show the pictures, all of a sudden it's a 4, and you need, you say it's a 10, and you need, say it's a 7, and you needed a 6 to have it installed as long as it wasn't in the historic district. it simplifies the review because then everyone is looking at the same goalposts
Right,
and the same valuation method. And then periodically, the HDC may, as a group, update the numerical values. And then, because if you, over a 10-year period, you get a completely different group of HDC members, they're still working within the same framework, but perhaps the technology changes the way we think it is, and they're gonna be more like the Tesla or even better in terms of no distinguishing visual characteristics. So I don't know, I'm just trying to think of different ways that we might approach it.
I, just to,
Andy and then,
I think that's a great format. I think, something similar to that is what we should adopt, and we can have a conversation about that either before we do deep dives into these components or at the end, but I think the sooner we contemplate what the format of the presentation is and what the format of the guidelines are, the better it will help to guide our discussions. I'll say that. And also, to that point, it's not too early to start considering who we can get as volunteers or students or some group that can actually do that work. So I think it would be prudent for our group to consider, looking out into next year and take the burden off of this team to build out what that looks like and look to another entity. And that could be another group of students or some volunteer group or paid group.
yeah, I totally agree, and that is in the bottom of the last page.
Why didn't you say
Is that
so?
right? Well, I want to let you get some airtime here, brother. But it may not specifically say that, but it talks about development, of identifying resources, developing resources. And it's at the bottom of the page because, so again, just to reiterate, I think it's beneficial for us all. The process we're undertaking right now is we have a list. We're fleshing that list out reasonably. So then we can take that list as a whole, as a group, a work group, we can determine the relative importance of each of the items, the master item and then the sub items. We can look at the master item to determine the relative importance and relative to the others. Then we can sort those based on the importance, high, medium, low, whatever we want to do in the numerical system 1 through 5. And then we can prioritize each of those groups. So this is really important, but then we want to prioritize it. We may have something that's really important, but it's going to be a dog because we need resources, we need other information. We're not going to get to it, so it's a lower priority. It's still important, but it's a low priority. Then we can resort the list based upon, if so, importance and priority. And then we're going to sit down and have a discussion amongst ourselves of each of these. The idea being that some of the ones that are highly important would be, and a high priority in my mind, would be things we can immediately move to the HDC and get on the books, for an example.
as a best practice.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and then the other one would be items that are important, but that we need to establish resources for. And what we might say is, okay, let's have this Wednesday, we're going to talk about recommendation items. This Wednesday, we're going to talk about resource related items. So we're going to get together. We're going to have all the things that we need resources that are of a high level of importance, and we'll brainstorm and try and come up with some homework to get other people involved. Because as you said, we want to be looking forward. And part of that for me is that we're engaging people sooner to be on their schedule, to determine one, who they are, how we get on their schedule, and so on and so forth.
Okay.
So I think I'm just articulating my thoughts on it. I hope that's helpful.
That's great.
And you can't put all that, I don't have time to put all that into a little paragraph at the bottom of
That was 3 paragraphs.
the list of items.
We're good.
Yeah, and I encourage people to watch the meetings because, they're boring and I'm talking a lot, but I'm trying to just establish our process. And I think it's important because it's going to make things a lot easier once we get our testing going. Okay,
Thanks.
So figure 13 is, I think each of these recommended I just would suggest that these would fall into the categorization of, let's call it a 3-level, not visible, visible, and visible requiring mitigations, and then what are those mitigations? Because these could be figures 12, 13, and 14, all could be, some of them are almost approvable on consent. I think we need to articulate that.
Yeah.
What it
For
is.
sure.
Because there's gonna be owners who may think, oh, I heard this, I heard the HCs, they're horrible. And they want the earth to warm and they want the island to flood. But it's not the case. And if we have clearer guidelines, they might understand, oh gee, I have a shed that faces south. And even though it faces the road, you can't see it under any circumstance. And I could fill that whole thing with solar panels and solve or whatever issue I have.
Yeah, and I think from a design perspective, to build on that, it only makes half of the energy I need for my house, but if I add a pergola off the shed or off the back deck, now I've accommodated the home. So if they know that up front and the
Right.
designers know that up front,
Right,
that's really relevant to the design process. Because
Yeah.
they're already checking the boxes when they're filling out the paperwork, so.
and everybody has little side buildings now, ancillary structures.
Yeah, and-
Everything.
A huge part of it is, right, we get, to your point about the design, getting designers involved is, you can slightly rotate a shed.
Right.
You could change the roof orientation so that instead of being a gable forward towards the pool, it's a shed roof and you get your solar on your south elevation. Well, you don't put the dormer on it, on the cabana, on the front, you put it on the back, because the front is south. Or maybe you rethink about how you're orienting your pool relative to the main house and then the cabana. So solar right becomes part of the designer's
Overall
thought
layout.
process. And those are the types of things I think that the HDC can encourage by having clear guidelines. And then it'll be a matter of time, right? It'll be a matter of people coming in and kind of understanding how it really plays out. Part of our role and, clearly part of the role, the recommendations that we make in adopting our guidelines is then holding our fellow commissioners' toes to, to those guidelines. Because something's not a majority vote, revisiting on a regular basis one person's concern, when it's a policy, it's wasteful. I'm not suggesting that people's voices shouldn't be heard. I'm just suggesting that, stuff we need to keep in mind too. We hit what's not in here, which is this sequestration. There's a lot of verbiage in here that I think is important, so, I'll suggest that we, the creative placement of PV and solar thermal collectors may be encouraged if such placement limits any adverse impact of the array. Because local groups typical of Nantucket's built environment are such a character defining feature of the island's cultural heritage, which it is. Rooftop equipment installation should be carefully designed and positioned on any roof, which is what we're talking about. The basic elements of design to consider are balance, proportion, color, rhythm, and scale. So that's a very nice way of saying what we've been talking about. Additionally, PV and solar thermal collectors should be kept on the same plane as the roof. Not sure I understand that.
Same pitch, same plane.
Same
parallel.
pitch. Yeah, okay, coplanar. With the color of the panels in keeping with surrounding roof materials, so coplanar. Okay. Do you guys review these? Do you want to, now that we've kind of walked through just a little bit, I mean, we've done a lot, but some of the HDC's current, everything we've talked about is consistent with the HDC's current guidelines. I think the primary difference between these, I know the primary difference between these and the HDC current practices the last several years is a full roof on a black asphalt shingle, a full array, left to right, top to bottom. But what are your guys, have you got markups on these or thoughts you want to?
No, I think it's pretty straightforward. Just to clarify, the full array, I think is important. Besides that, I think we do need to flush out top third, bottom third, best practice. Mechanically versus best practice for visibility. That's reasonable, but that's kind of low hanging fruit, pretty easy to address. So is there anything else that's not in here that's been besides full array or full coverage? That's being approved today?
Well, like,
We're not.
we're gonna
We're
be
not,
adding,
the sawtooth,
right,
So there's no sawtooth
the
language
pipe
here.
thing,
yeah, so that's, and then we've got that in our existing list,
Right,
but it will of items, but it will relate to these.
sure.
I think, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
So in the context of what we, these three categories, right? Non-visible, it's the visible one. So I think if we could have a rules-based definition, and we would be more than happy to volunteer, we could build an appropriateness calculator, which is, I think, what you've been alluding to, Stephen. We use this concept, it's a spreadsheet, but you talk about weightings and priorities. We could actually build an appropriateness calculator where the developer just defined the solar system in the context of this calculator. And it would spit out a number, and that would be submitted as part of the application.
Right, and the thing I would suggest we do is so a little more advanced calculator in a sense than a pairwise comparison. So multi-criteria, multi-person decision-making tool would be a analytical hierarchy processing approach. And basically you break things down into categories, you weight the categories relative to one another, and the items within the categories you weight. So it's a numerical. I did this at Capital Program Committee. We do this for millions of dollars worth of projects every year.
Is this what you're recommending?
I'm just a suggestion, right? To try and make it easy, the easier we make the use of the rules, both
Sure.
the developer, the client, and the HDC, the more likelihood it's going to be, it's just going to be easier to work with, right?
Yeah.
With the goal of getting more stuff on consent.
Well, so the beauty of what I'm talking about is it's a very specific approach. I mean, NASA used it for designing, they used it in technical for technical things and designing rockets, and Fortune 500 companies use it. The reason I think it's helpful is because there's software available, it's cheap. I used a mathematician in Singapore to help Capital Program Committee. It makes, everything is transparent. You can put it into a list. It could be, it could become a spreadsheet that's operational that can be passed out. The beauty of it is that as a living document, the HCC members, there, would be a half-hour session where once we establish the criteria and then we break them down into categories, then we as HDC weigh in by voting on the valuation based on our individual subjective opinions of the guidelines of the criteria. And then it establishes for the elements for the criteria on a criterion level, the installer can then add another layer, which is applicability. So you have this system, it's clear, it's a spreadsheet, it lists out what the categories of the criteria are, the individual criterion. It then establishes what the valuation of each of those criterion are relative to their category. I'm killing you, I'm sorry. And then
Focused on.
and then basically what you end up with is that the beauty of it is it's transparent. You can see as a designer that it's not going to be rocket science, that
That's not difficult.
a certain thing is more important than something else. The back of the house categories, lack of visibility is going to get you more points than visibility. In the visibility category, a secondary mass might get you the same points as mitigation measures, which is trees. So then you can kind of sit there as a designer and you can say, gee, if I'm just looking at this, if I put this behind the house, can't do that. Other things going on there. I can program this in where it's on an ancillary structure behind a tree, and I'm gonna get some of the highest points. This is like a consent item. The beauty of that approach is if we went down that road is we can do it ourselves and it can relatively easily be updated every 5 years
Or less.
or less.
On a vote.
Well, it basically, you have a half an hour work, commissioner meeting and you do the same process again. The other thing that's, useful for it is that through that same process, you can not only reweight the process of reweighting by votes, which are subjective and translated to a transparent ranking system. You can, add categories. So you can add criteria, category and criterion. So if something changes with the module, the actual solar modules, we could be adding, I don't know what it is, but it's flexible is my
Yeah,
point.
I think, a vision here is that, you know, we have this appropriateness calculator for solar.
Yeah.
And the designer downloads a spreadsheet, puts in for this particular design, hands it in with the application. It comes up to the HDC. The first question the HDC board says, what did it score on the calculator?
Exactly.
Right,
Yeah,
right,
Oh, it got 100. It should be good to go.
right.
And there's some sort of known threshold. And you guys still take a look at it.
Oh, yeah.
Right, still take a look at it, but there is one strong data point, it's scored 100. So in theory, it should pass. If it doesn't pass, then what is it? Oh, well, nah, you know, that's why we still don't like it, even though it got 100, and there's a learning there.
But, right, and then,
So
so
it could
then,
go the other way as well. It's only scored 80, but it's really okay because of something, you know.
right, could be anything from 65 to 85 needs to be up in front of the board.
yeah, and below 65, don't,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah, don't
turn it
bother.
in.
Yeah, right.
But that, and that will be an iterative process. When we get to that point, I think it's, you know, that's the way I would like to, you know, when I said it initially as an index, whether we call it a. You know, whether we do it as a AHP project and we call the result a calculator or not, I think it's great to call it that. It boils it down to simplistic.
We build them all the time.
Yeah,
I mean, it's really, they're very, very simple to build in a spreadsheet. I mean, like a couple of hours. If someone were to give me the rules, I could give it back to you guys the next day.
Yeah.
It's
well, so that the reason I went with the AHP in the software was because it's built to be modify itself with a group of people. So you can do this all live at once.
AHP is the software or?
Well, it's no,
process?
that's the process, but that's the software I was using is, you know, it's scripted, so you can input these things and you can juggle them around. It's kind of like a bird rating in a sense, in some of the calculators I'm sure you're using.
Well, National Grid has one.
Yeah.
We use one with National Grid, one of their incentive relays. So there's a whole bunch of rules that they have, you know,
Right.
what's the service, you know, what's the utility, you know, is it affordable housing, is it blah, 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 blah,
Right.
blah. There's all these
Right.
different things, and eventually it spits out some incentive.
And the reason, the benefit of the software I'm talking about is it adds so you're talking about multi-criteria. It adds the multi-decision maker aspect to it, because then everyone gets a chance to weigh in individually in their own inputs. And then the software puts it all together. So you have a team, a commission, a commission determined calculator that's based upon the individuals, each of the individuals' inputs. So however we get there, I think it's, you know, it's good discussion, and it's definitely one that's gonna be on our list is the index / calculator. Because I think that if we're trying to help people, the takeaway really, right, is how does this translate into application? And an application is we're trying to get architects, designers, and homeowners to become involved in approvable solar.
So this index needs to be in clean alignment. Every point in the index should have a corresponding reference and explanation here.
Yeah.
So that someone that uses as a reference guide make their judgments based on
Yeah.
criteria.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, or at the end of the 45 minutes to an hour discipline, knows that they're likely going to be approved, and we've had success.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that. I think that's excellent pursuit. That's
I-
mine.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
And so like, that's one that's, to me, would probably be a high importance. And it's gonna it's gonna be a low priority initially. But then we're gonna have to revisit our ranking systems ourselves for these items, because as we progress, there may be reasons to change. One may be a temporal aspect, so timing. So right now, we don't need to necessarily develop the resources to develop the calculator. But later in our process, we're gonna need to, so it's gonna move up the rank of priority. So that'll be, part of our monitoring and self-assessment. I think what I'd like to do is suggest just, at this point, the HDC, I think of these guidelines, one of the items that we want to move forward to the HDC almost immediately is adopt formally what it is we do now. Because some of what we do now, what we've been doing for several years, is inconsistent with guidelines, written guidelines, which is part of the reason why we're updating things. But I think it's worthwhile to, this is an OFC type of a thing. I welcome the comment, but I think one of our best practice recommendations is, gee, guys, we need to formally adopt what we do now versus what's in here if there's anything in conflict. So I made a note to that effect. I
Okay.
think we should wait for some reason.
No, because then it can become part of the process, the approval process that. People say we don't have.
Okay, so. So I wanted to bring that up, and then, are there other ones, well, we're kind of just free talking here. Do you think that there's any, is the plumbing vent stack one that we want to get out?
That's easy.
Yeah, anything that's easy, yes, and then it moves up in priority, how to define it in here. So, making sure that we can clearly define it and who's going to write it. I mean, you guys have a lot of work to do already. So
Yeah,
formalizing this language, I think is a heavy lift, so just being clear about what that pass is gonna look like, and who's gonna put that together.
yeah, I agree. And then the other thing I'd suggest is that there is utility in just bringing it up
Yeah,
in commissioner comments and saying, look. One of the things that we've identified with respect to the plumbing stack vent is. Don't locate it on the south side of the structure, and certainly if it's not visible. Dormers would be another one,
mhm.
so that, because what happens
Make
is,
your southern roof plain and simple.
Amen.
yeah, because what we have, we have a ton of designers sitting there, some actively listening, some not, during every meeting. So we bring these up a couple of times, even though we haven't gotten to the point where we're doing a formal guideline.
Okay.
We're bringing into the kind of the designer consciousness is what I'm trying to get to.
Well, I would propose a working document with this bullet list, then it doesn't have to be anything more than that.
Yeah.
Of what's currently approved, and that's contrary or outside the scope of what's here. So,
Right.
and that could be a document that's readily accessible.
Yeah, and well, what I'm saying is an intermediary step, which is until we get somebody to write that little list and then decide where we're gonna put it, is let's talk about, let's adopt formally what we do now versus what the old guidelines are. Clear, vent stack location, dormers versus simple roof planes. We can discuss that. I can bring it up. We can have a brief discussion at a meeting once a month. And it's gonna start to be heard by people. And we can talk about not just simplistically, but let's get into some shared responsibility, starting to introduce the concepts that we're trying to evoke. And do it at regular meetings during the commissioner comments section. Until we get to an actual written list.
Okay.
Yeah, so that they can be employed
Yeah,
sooner rather than later.
kind of broadcasting. is what
Yeah.
I-
If you add it to the agenda, if you add, say, these 3 items that we just recognized, it just added to the agenda in
Yeah.
commissioner comments. And now it's public record, and then you can refer back to that as
Yeah.
a living document, and
Yeah.
that should be adequate.
Yeah. Well, I think your idea is good too, is like, because we need something in between, like, for us to keep track of.
Right,
That's not the recommendation yet, it's the list. So what we'll do is, I think what we'll do is we'll add these to the item list, some of them are there, one of them isn't.
Mhm.
And then we'll color code, we'll probably put in a color code system, so. Things that have been, recommended to the HDC. Vocally are like a light green, and things that have been recommended to the HDC in writing are like a green, like a Kelly green. And then things, you know what I mean, like we might just make a simple way to be able to identify, process this information. With respect to whether it's been advanced to a written recommendation, whether it's been adopted. Yeah, I'll come up with something. It doesn't have to be, you have a color key code and it doesn't have to be complicated. It's just you have to look at the key code when you're processing all this information. Because we're trying to process for all these different variables in way.
right.
And values,
Being the commissioners.
well, even being the work group. Like, oh, what did we recommend to them already?
Oh,
Oh, did we recommend that in writing or did we just talk about it?
Okay.
So just a way that we can kind of keep track of that aspect
Sure.
of this process.
Yeah, I was already looking at it from the public perspective.
Yeah,
Where is that list?
Yeah.
Where is the,
no, and that's awesome because you're public, you're one of our at-large members, so you're public centric. All right, I'm getting a little crunchy.
that's right.
We didn't talk about existing buildings, though. Most of these we were talking about is planning for new structures.
Okay, I'm gonna take Tim because I think he's gonna
Okay.
announce his departure.
So if it was an existing building, we could still implement it in the appropriateness calculator and it's gonna spit out a number.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Right? This is just an offer. I'm happy to drop the generic calculator.
I appreciate that.
Without, and then you provide the.
Right, and we're gonna footnote that because we're so, like, we need to get the list fleshed out. Level of importance, prioritization, then discussion, and then we can get to the point where we've got those particular. Criterion
oh,
Whoa.
for the calculator.
Yeah,
So I registered the offer.
Yeah, and just one, it's not a hurdle, it's very easy thing to do.
I know, and we're gonna be examining the algorithm to make sure it's.
take me.
Even-
I'm here to
No gaming, seriously.
Thanks, Tim.
enjoy your afternoon.
How come these Act Smart applications seem to get a higher score than everyone else? Jeez. Fine, that was the macro.
That was a joke. It wasn't.
Serious.
Happy Thanksgiving, bud. Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy
Oh,
Thanksgiving.
yeah, right.
Thanks, Tim. A couple of your contributions. Okay, so yeah, existing and we'll fit it into the framework.
Okay, they're a little bit more challenging, of
For
course.
sure,
Yeah.
but to Stephen's earlier point about carbon and sequestration, you may get a graded value or a higher value.
Yeah.
Or an accommodation of a percentage for using an existing building for your solar.
Yeah.
Maybe, just
Maybe, no, I
a
mean,
possibility,
it makes sense.
right, rather than tear it down or build another structure just to accommodate it.
Right.
So,
And that has broader community benefits, because, you're typically not gonna be getting a 10-foot ceiling on 2 floors, and all of a sudden your electric
I
bill
don't know
is.
why they need to be so high. People didn't get that much dollar.
certainly not in my family.
Okay,
Yeah,
on a good note, I think that what we'll do is if someone can look at a calendar for me, and my battery's still off.
hold on.
So we would not be meeting until November 30th. Our first Wednesday off, except for when.
I won't be here.
So it's on the 30th.
I have a dentist appointment on Friday
So,
at 3 o'clock.
shall we pick up December 7th? Or should we try for the 30th and, yeah, I can't convene an OFC meeting
Right, by yourself.
by myself.
Well, there's the limitation, so let's just go for the 7th.
Okay, so why don't we plan on December 7th? It'll be Wednesday at 3:30. And, I'll put together an agenda. Once we get normalized, I think we're kind of there. I'm gonna ask you if you don't mind to take over the agenda thing. I didn't want to give you something to do, is all. You've got other stuff to do. But, But I think, going forward, and please, we'll let, Mary and Lucy know, the members of the group, is that plan to meet on Wednesday. Plan to meet on the Wednesday announced at the previous meeting,
Got it.
and it will post it on the town's calendar,
Oh, so not December 30th, sorry.
No, November 30th or December 30th.
December 7th,
December.
right? That's the Wednesday, first Wednesday in December.
Okay,
Does that work for you guys?
and so,
I feel like we're getting somewhere.
Yeah, I would say, I agree. I'm encouraged. I think that gives us 3 full weeks to finish this list. And I think that should be our goal so that we're done with the build out.
By the end of the year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was the 7th, the 14th, and then the 21st, if everyone decides that we can meet the 21st, which is,
Right.
I will be here.
right, so we only have 2 days, two meetings before the end of the year to flush this process.
And then we can get into levels of prioritization.
Right.
Which should be a much shorter discussion.
Yeah, we can do that the first meeting of January.
Yeah, because keep in mind, just because it is itself a living document, so we might say, hey, you know what, my thought process has changed, somebody might bring it up, and I think this is more important and why, and if the other members are persuaded, then we can just change it.
100%.
So I think the first part of this process is much weightier.
Yeah, but we've made some good progress.
Okay, so I'll announce the date and time of our next meeting is Wednesday, December 7th. And at 3:30 p.m. And I will ask, unless there are other comments.
I just want to, what's the name of the calculator that you're proposing? What's the name of the
Well, it's
worksheet?
it's not really, it's so it's analytical hierarchy processing.
Oh, the HP, that's for the,
AHP. And then it's basically,
okay, thanks.
you can use it different ways, but it's a multi-criterion, multi-decision maker tool.
Great. I think it's a great solution, and I think it engages and invests all the parties at on the commission,
Yeah,
so that there's real viability to it.
Well, and it takes out a lot of the guesswork.
Yeah,
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 and y'all are the ones that made it the priorities as commission.
right. So there's a huge ownership component. The other thing that's huge is you can be as subjective as you want to be. And your subjectivity is reflected in your score, and then it's weighted as an individual amongst the commission, just like your vote.
Right.
So everyone's represented fairly. And then we vote on it and it's settled.
Right.
And then individuals can use that calculator. The component that's gonna be a little more difficult is I touched on this briefly, is the level of applicability. So what I mean by that is, we'll use a simple thing, it's, well, it's not a simple thing, I was gonna say visibility. But there are gonna be, the designer would input, I foresee, in their process, whether it's 100% true or 50% true. Because you shouldn't not get points if something is 50% true, but you should only get 50% of the relative points.
Mhm. Sure.
So there'll need to be some instructions there, and that's where the commission's review or staff's review, once we get it all up and running, of pictures will be relevant. And in some instances, pictures aren't gonna cut it. We're gonna have to do a view.
mhm.
And part of the view packet will be the printout of the calculator. And we can go and look at it and say, well, that's not 50% on visibility, like that's 0. You need to correct that.
Yeah.
And we make notes and we can bring it up at the hearing. Okay,
Thanks.
terribly interesting stuff. Any other comments? That's maybe we appreciate you being here.
Thanks, Edmund.
Motion to adjourn.
Thank you, very unanimous.